The reason why this is so complicated is because normally in a case where you say that somebody who has been engaged in terrorist activity, there are different elements to it. There is, first of all, the violence of action, which clearly happened in this case terribly. And secondly, the desire to terrorize, to frighten, to intimidate a community. And this was, he clearly had an intent to challenge girls in a dance class in that community. So it wasn't simply mindless violence. He had a purpose, but the purpose wasn't to change the direction of government for a cause. He wasn't part of a network. He wasn't part of an organization. He didn't have an ideology. And the reason why he hadn't been referred and taken up by Prevent was because that third element wasn't there. And the reason why the judge ends up not going for a whole life tariff isn't only his age, but also he doesn't come under the terrorist legislation, because the view of the police and then the CPS was that he didn't pass that third threshold. And it's kind of an interesting question as to whether that needs to be looked at, because I think what we are seeing, and this is the second thing the inquiry has to look at, is the growth of violence amongst young men, not just in Britain. There was a Five Eyes, which is the America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the UK report, public report back in December on the growth of extremism amongst children, amongst under 18s, which is happening particularly under younger men in all of our countries, and it has been happening for some years, sometimes linked to neurodiversity, very often linked to people who spend a lot of time on social media, seeing very difficult and violent stuff. But the report says in the UK case, people who are involved for a cause or a purpose, whether it was Islamic terrorism or far-right activity, that's actually gone down. Increasingly, it's people who are dangerous and have a vulnerability, but it doesn't seem to be linked to any purpose other than kind of anger and violence. And so in that way, I think that the analogy here is less to do with, a terrorist attack and much more to do with the kind of shootings we've seen in American high schools over the last 10 years, young men going into a place to hurt and maim and kill, where their purpose is to do the killing, but it's normally based upon, an anger and a misogyny, but it doesn't really pass the normal terrorist definition. So, which then leads to the third question for the review, which is, should we be thinking about terrorism in a different way, with different definitions, different legal definitions, different ways in which the government goes about worrying about these dangerous young men?
See, I think we've got to be careful here. So first of all, let's look at some obvious points. One of the reasons why we don't have the regular high school massacres that tragically they have in the United States is not because we have less deranged individuals who might want to do this kind of thing. It's that they can't have access to guns.
But he intended to go into a school the week before with a knife. And you can do quite a lot of damage with a knife as well.
And they're cracking down again on kind of knife sales. But, first of all, Britain does do an incredible job in the modern age, when it's really easy to in other countries get hold of guns. It's worth remembering it does an incredible job at kind of with keeping guns very hard to reach for many people. So second, I would be really nervous of trying to muddy the definition of terrorism. And, it's worth noting the Home Office, Yvette Cooper, your partner, a review was commissioned, an internal review, which subsequently leaked, into should the definitions of things change and extremism. And someone came up with saying, well, maybe if you've got views about two-tier policing, this is like the police treating far-right extremists more harshly than Islamists, that's a contribution to extremism. The only problem is, like, the leader of the Conservative Party has said that herself, and various other kind of top politicians. So you've got to be really careful, I think, about making this sort of, essentially kind of losing, the common consent of what is terrorism and what is extremism. And I would keep terrorism as, a definition based around an ideologically motivated, however perverse you might think the ideology thing, ideologically motivated attack. And therefore you can draw in like resources like MI5 who are properly counter-terrorism and counter-terrorist organizations as well as counter-espionage. But once you say it's all extremism, all kind of crime that might be kind of anarchic and violent, I think you kind of lose focus. And then I think, there's just a big practical job to be done, which I remember after those terrible Soham murders was done, of learning the lessons of how agencies and police forces and the like, failed to talk to each other enough or failed to join the dots. And it's quite sort of painstaking kind of government work, and it's not particularly, it's not as sort of politically interesting as let's rewrite the definition of extremism. If you look at this case, I would say as someone from the outside, although someone who's been a minister, that's where the real issues are. It's not that we didn't get the definition of extremism right. It's that no one managed to join the dots between the police turning up 5 times at this person's home, the school reporting a violent incident, the person being expelled from a school, all of those things which, you must have come across when you were children's secretary in the equally tragic but very different cases of children who were abused and killed by their parents. And then people go like, well, why on earth weren't all the clues put together? And it's, I think, kind of having some grand theory and some grand argument in politics about terrorism, is a risky place to go, because I don't think you necessarily achieve much.
I think that's right. But the dangerous thing is when you're dealing with new challenges, which we haven't dealt with in quite this way before, and how you make sure you are equipped and understand it. And I don't think, as societies, we haven't dealt with this scale of young men becoming so, in their bedrooms, engaged in such extreme violence and what that can do to them. And there's a spectrum. And look, of course, very many of those young men will have this for a phase and then get over it. And very many of them who do it will not be drawn into violent action, but some of them clearly are, and some of them could be drawn into, groomed into doing that for a cause or for a purpose. And so you can't rule out the possibility of that bleeding into terrorist activity. But in a big macro way, what is happening to our societies and to our young people, and what is the responsibility of social media companies? And clearly people like Andrew Tate and other social influencers are telling vulnerable, not just incel, but wider young men that their anger and their misogyny is justified and appropriate. And in some cases that leads to action. So there is a kind of a global regulatory responsibility, but then there is also just a more prosaic question, which is, what do you do when you're worried?
Could I just pick you up on on this really interesting and somewhat alarming development of the manosphere? When you reference people like Andrew Tate, this is this sort of men feeling their masculinity has been taken away from them by wokedom. I mean, I'm massively simplifying, but this is how they would put it. I think it's interesting. Personally, I'd say, and obviously there's nothing to justify what happened in Southport or indeed some of the other violent attacks, but it is also true that if you tell people their concerns are illegitimate, if you try and just simply block them seeing material on the internet, I think that's only part of the answer. And you've got to tell young men that they've got a value in life, that there is a sort of legitimate outlet for masculinity, and we may have gone too far in the other direction, and that's created off some legitimate concern a whole load of illegitimate concerns, and people have exploited that, and ultimately in some cases with terrible results.
The thing is, I could agree with you, and also say when you talk to teachers, they say teachers have been teaching for 20 or 30 years that these days the reaction of young men to stories like Othello or Macbeth or of mice and men being studied in the classroom, that they react differently to 10, 20, 30 years ago, that they are more inclined to be misogynistic in their reactions. There is no doubt that very many schools worry about the way images are passed around between boys and girls, and the attitudes which can go along with that. Obviously, that is a much wider problem, but that can lead to action, and that's something you have to be concerned about. But that is like the big regulatory sphere. But then you have the individual case. If you take the case of of Southport, when we see the inquiry, it was decided by Prevent that he was not at risk of being involved in terror. And it wasn't for them, 4 years before the attack. But clearly he was increasingly violent. And clearly different agencies were involved. You can't say in the case of Southport that he fell between the cracks. Although that does happen. And just in passing, let me just point out, after the Victoria Climbié death, one of the recommendations was that there should be a database of individual agency contacts with children called Contact Point, which I was kind of in a later stage involved in delivering, which then got abolished in 2010 because I think the Liberal Democrats thought it was an affront to people's civil liberties as opposed to a way of trying to make sure that young people didn't fall through the gaps when they were at risk. But in the case of Southport, who was responsible? If it wasn't a terror case, he wasn't at risk of being radicalised into terror. Whose responsibility was it as events occurred to say, I'm increasingly worried about this? Who's holding the ring? And, in the case of child protection, you have multi-agency teams in local areas with the police and contact with schools and social workers worrying about those at-risk children. I'm not sure that we do enough of the same thing now with young men who are worrying, and schools are worried about, and parents are worried about, and they may have committed or been accused of a crime. And are we worrying about the young people who might be at risk of ending up in a more violent, extreme action? You don't have to say that is terrorism to say it's terrifying and dangerous, and you need to kind of be thinking about who is preventing that. And, as I said, the Department of Children, Schools and Families was the department which held the ring across all of Whitehall. At the moment, is this something which should be driven by the Home Office, who are about policing and terror? Or is it about education and schools? Is it really their job? Is it about social media, which is another department which is rather promoting of social media? Do we have, area by area, people who are together between police and other kind of people, experts, worrying about the kids who are at risk? Because if we're not doing that, we're not going to intervene to stop this kind of Southport case occurring.
You make a very strong point, but I think knowing Whitehall as you and I do, I think you have to have the Home Office ultimately in charge, because you've got to bring the police in and you've got to bring police intelligence into it. And the Home Office, I'm not sure would work well with some other department like local government, which is, or indeed education, in charge. In fact, I think the challenges of Prevent is that the local government department has been running it.